Be like, them people just, they don't understand what's going on. They need to get with this right here. Like, I would have had no clue.
This is Max Rameau, strategist, theorist, author, and organizer with Pan-African Community Action, and you are listening to The Next World. On this show, we explore and celebrate the work of poor people's movements, particularly in the U.S. We highlight innovative and powerful organizing campaigns and community building led by women, LGBTQ folks, Black communities, and other people of color that are pushing the boundaries and have the potential to transform society. Today on the show, we talk to Ruth Idakula of the Dignity in Schools campaign about organizing against the school-to-prison pipeline and finding what sustains you in this work. All right, great. So, Ruth, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about the Dignity in Schools campaign?
Yes, certainly can. The Dignity in Schools campaign is a coalition of mostly grassroots organizations found nationally, concentrated in the South, West Coast, and the Northeast. Grassroots organizations who have been doing work around the school-to-prison pipeline. We've been around about 16 years. Actually, this is our 16th anniversary in 2022. And we pretty much do work around school climate. And when I say school climate, that means the environment with which our children are dealing with when they're in schools. That looks like anything from the curriculum to safety issues to wraparound services. When I say wraparound services, I mean things like making sure that there's a nurse on staff, a counselor, social worker, those kinds of things. And so,
because not all schools have that, right? There are some schools that do not.
A lot of schools don't. A lot of schools don't. You would be amazed. I live in the South, specifically New Orleans. I've been doing this work around education advocacy for a good maybe 15 years now, and the stories are just ridiculous.
Yeah, and it's interesting that all the schools seem to have police, but they don't all have nurses, they don't all have therapists, or they don't all have social workers or whatever. Some of the things that you would think that you would need in order to get support from the school that they don't all have, right?
Very interesting, isn't it? Yes,
yeah.
We have police, but then we don't have nurses, we don't have...
Yeah, so someone is having a mental health issue at school, they can't get therapy, but they can get arrested.
They can get arrested if you act out in any way. A lot of these policies have come from what we call zero tolerance, meaning that, a child cannot act out in any way. Otherwise, the consequences are that you are removed from the classroom. And there are punitive things, one of them being, unfortunately, that children can end up being arrested and put in the criminal justice system.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
So, all right, speaking of the criminal justice system, we hear the term a lot, but I'm not sure everyone operates off of the same definition. What is the school-to-prison pipeline?
The school-to-prison pipeline basically is the phenomenon of children entering the incarceration system through schools. And historically, let me just add that this comes from Columbine, right? Mm-hmm. After that, there were a series of policies that were put in place by the Clinton administration that limited the amount of behaviors that children could enact in schools. And so what that led up to was that children couldn't be children anymore, right? There's such a thing that educators know of as child and adolescent behavior. It is something that is studied in psychology, and all teachers, if they are degreed, know this or have this, wealth of information, which it's a scientific thing that, children's brains are still developing up until their mid-20s. And so there is allowance of behaviors, in terms of, children growing up that now have become criminalized, right? So for instance, if a 5-year-old pulls on another child's hair in the classroom, typical behavior for children, those kinds of things are now penalized, and that can land a child not only to be suspended or expelled, but sometimes even the cops are called, depending on the teacher and their experience in the classroom. And also, I say a lot of this also is cultural, because what you find is that the majority of children or students that are in the school-to-prison pipeline tend to be Black and brown children. Mm-hmm. So there definitely is a racial component
Right. And because you bring up the thing of something that you described as typical for children to do, which is pulling each other's hair, for example, which then if adults did it to one another, even I'm not a big criminal person, punitive justice type of person, you could see why that would be like, okay, this is a no-no, where in
Right.
children it would be like, you want to, maybe you'd be directed. But then it's not even applied equally, because then you have, some children, older children, like the young white boy who was an athlete who raped a young woman
Yes, I remember
in
that
an
story.
alley in a dumpster, and then his father described it as getting a few minutes of action, and then was given a really, really light slap on the wrist by the judge, because the judge did not want to ruin this person's college. So in some cases, I guess 5-year-olds could get punished more harshly for pulling someone's hair than a young person 17, 18 years old can get punished for raping another young person.
Right. And so what you're
that's in that sense racialized, not just the behaviors, but there is a racial and class problem.
For sure, definitely it is racialized. And so what you're finding is that a lot of children who end up in the criminal justice system now have a record. That record follows them into adulthood, and that limits their opportunities, experiences, quality of life, right? And so what you find is that we're kind of perpetuating what is very much a perpetual caste system, where Black and brown people are continually on the lowest rung in terms of any kind of social mobility in the society, or whatever's left of it. Let me put it that way. Creation of wealth and all of the identifiers, right, in terms of what we in the society deem to be markers of success.
And this is happening throughout, obviously, and you really identified some of the beginnings of it as the early 90s, but this is happening throughout the society in every state, basically.
It's happening in every state, yes.
Everywhere.
You do have places where the concentration of the demographics are mostly white. You find that there are less of these problems, interestingly enough, in these demographics. But when you find where you have a significant population of Black people or Latin people, Latinx people, you find that, these are very much issues. And also, the LGBTQ community as well, and also children with disabilities. And so we are not putting in schools ways for children to have access for things to help them thrive or to cope or to deal with their own anxieties, especially right now where there's all kinds of things happening, right? Like, we're still going through COVID, even though some people, would deem that, well, COVID's over or the pandemic's over. It's not.
Or that it never started.
Right, or that it never started, right? Like, yeah, there's a whole spectrum. But, whatever your belief is, there are people who are still struggling with the kind of domino effect that created, right?
Right.
People, still unemployed, people still struggling to keep food on the table.
And the problem is not so much that they're struggling. I mean, that is obviously as a whole problem, but in terms of what you're focused on, it's not so much that they're struggling, but it's that the response to their struggling, to their saying, I'm frustrated, and maybe even causing some harm to a desk or causing some harm to another student in ways that are not good, but certainly in the range of what the way children behave, then is criminalized instead of being recognized as a call for help or
as a symptom of something that is deeper and larger.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, let's try to intersect a couple of issues. So you're identifying this here as the school to prison pipeline as something that's happening, and the criminalizing, the system is criminalizing children, and then that really sets them up and continues the criminalization oftentimes as they are adults. Let's intersect this with something here. Hurricane Katrina hits New Orleans in 2005?
2005, August 2005.
August 2005. As a result, lots of people are forced out of New Orleans, and disproportionately of those people are Black people. And then in a wave which some saw pretty clearly coming and others didn't see as clearly, but there's an overall trend in the United States in general to have these charter schools.
Yes.
And to have the privatization of some of a good chunk of public schools through charters or through whichever ways that they're doing. What happened after Hurricane Katrina with the rebuilding or the reopening? After this massive destruction and then a bunch of people moving out, what happened to the rebuilding of public schools in New Orleans and in the surrounding areas?
Excellent question. One of the very interesting things to note that I think correlates to the larger discussion around what happened around education and also other institutions was that it was not the storm itself that created all the havoc, right? So I was living on the second floor of a duplex, and the storm came and went. We cleaned up, neighbors came out, we helped each other. Pieces of my ceiling fell in, the lights were out. No big deal. What happened was that Army Corps of Engineers had not done a good job of making sure that our levees were solid and could take the impact of the category that Hurricane Katrina was. And so what happens was that the levees broke. Some of us call it here the federal flood, right? And so that is what happened. And so another failure by the federal government, right? And so so people have to leave, right? The city is 80% underwater. Everybody's gone for the most part. That is when there was a meeting in Baton Rouge, which is our state capital, where they legislate or change the performance score of schools in Orleans Parish specifically, not in other parishes around the state, specifically Orleans Parish. Now, Hurricane Katrina impacted other parishes, but it was very interesting that they only chose to change the performance scores of schools in New Orleans. So they changed the scores so that it rendered most of the schools failing, which then caused them to be able to institute the Recovery School District, which then took over or was now the governance
Right. It
entity.
triggered an emergency where
there you go.
We're condemning the schools and the state's taking them over. Yeah.
Nicely put. The domino effect was in them firing all teachers and all staff of public schools in New Orleans. This is still while people are gone. This is within a couple of weeks of the hurricane hitting the city.
Wow.
So they fire everybody, right? And then
I'm sure people can't even get their notices at this point. They're not even They don't even know that they're being fired.
Right. So, people are finding out weeks afterwards, right, that they've been fired and have no job to come back to while they're dealing with being displaced and all of the emotional, psychological things that are happening with people and their families. So there's no job to come back to. And then there's a series of things that the federal government puts in place. The Department of Education put out a multi-million grant for people to apply for around the country to be able to come take over schools in New Orleans, right? There you go. To come take over schools in New Orleans. This is while people are still gone. So while people are still gone and trying to put their lives together, you have these different entities from around the country who are now coming to New Orleans and taking over school. This is before people even get here, right? Yeah. And so now you fire the teachers, people from around the country are coming in to take over schools. And then the next thing that happens is that Teach for America teachers are replacing the usual teachers who have been in the community, born and raised here, right? And so it changes the complete culture, the demographics of the school. And so when children
it's pretty instant. It's not like it changes over the course of 20 or 30 years. It's basically
this is within months. Yeah.
By January 1st of the next year.
I came back in May of 2006, and I had to, within 2 to 3 months, my youngest son, who was 6 at the time, had to change schools 3 times. One time he got left at school. The bus didn't have it together for the bus to pick him up. And so they showed up at the house and he wasn't on the bus. They didn't know where he was. It was just absolute chaos. And so by the time, the majority of the population was able to come back, those who were able to come back, the way the schools looked is completely different. And also there's actually no accountability. There's no governance. There is nothing for a parent. There's nowhere for a parent to go to outside the Recovery School District, which was in its own way not being it was not taking into account the needs of the community. It looked like it was pretty much a money grab, looking at it, in hindsight. And, it was just another way to privatize an institution.
And because it was privatized, there were no public entryways where parents could come in and say, this is being done incorrectly, or my child was. All right, so let's intersect that now. How did that impact or intersect with the school to prison pipeline? So now all the schools that were public are now private. What's the intersection between the privatization, the mass privatization of public schools in New Orleans and elsewhere as well, and the school to prison pipeline?
in New Orleans specifically, and I'm just using it as an example because after this happened in New Orleans, this experiment that you will, if you research, you can read about. They've now are implementing in other parts of the country. Was that now these children are coming back. They're traumatized from Hurricane Katrina, right? They're coming into schools where we do not have professional teachers. These are young people, for the most part, who got several weeks of training and now are placed in a school where they're not only supposed to teach children, but also to be able to deal with all of the things that come up with being psychologically traumatized. Hurricane Katrina.
And
then,
because they've only got several weeks of training, they didn't learn the thing that you mentioned earlier about what is normal childhood behavior.
Exactly. They have no clue about this, right? And so a child is acting out. And these are traumatized children. So there's another layer on top of that, right? And they don't know how to do it. But there is another layer, which is that culturally, New Orleans is not like a lot of cities, right? We come from a community where people hug each other a lot. There's a lot of communication. People, there's a language. It's just different. And so, for instance, I heard a lot of stories where a child would go to hug, the lunch lady, and they were not allowed to do so because that's inappropriate behavior, right?
Wow, yeah.
A lot of music was taken. And I'm not saying that schools in New Orleans before Hurricane Katrina were perfect. That is not what I'm saying at all. We had a lot of issues before Katrina, but these issues, I think, exacerbated what was already happening. And so, the schools are also not culturally friendly now for children who are born and raised here. And so you have confused children who don't understand what's going on, and their culture and their behavior is being now penalized. And also on top of that, poverty is being criminalized. New Orleans has a very high poverty rate. And so, when it comes to things like uniforms, children are kicked out of school because they show up, let's say, your shirt is white and, you put it in the laundry and it comes out pink because you threw a whole bunch of things in it and you can only afford that one uniform, you're kicked out of school. So there are just multiple layers. There's culture, there's child and adolescent behavior, and then there's poverty. And so all those three strikes, all those layers are being now used to penalize children.
And that it really has had an effect, do you think, of enhancing the school to prison pipeline, of basically making it easier to criminalize, not only because of the lack of training for the teachers, but also like these schools really they're trying to make a buck. They don't really have the time to be dealing with a bunch of children who are trying to work through their trauma.
Right. And so you saw a proliferation of detectors and law enforcement, some of them physically carrying weapons in schools. I don't care what anybody says. That's not a healthy environment for children to be able to relax and to be able to learn and absorb information, place to feel free, to feel welcomed.
Yeah. It doesn't seem age appropriate, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, Ruth.
Go ahead. Well, I have a question for you in terms of, because I read a little bit about you and the work that you've done. I'm very impressed, I must say.
I always ask guests not to Google me until after the interview.
Well, I'm sorry. It happened. But I want to ask you, just in terms of what I've shared already, how do you feel like elements of those of that story or that narrative has shown up in the work that you've done? Like what's the intersection there with the work that you've done around housing, affordable housing, and the work that you've done in Miami?
I think the narrative that you're laying out, what really resonates with me are the layers that are on top of each other. And you can see how you have, regular everyday people who have regular everyday stresses and problems and issues. But then when you layer something on top of that, like poverty, then, it exacerbates all of the underlying normal everyday human issues and problems that we have. And then you layer on top of that housing insecurity. You don't know where you're going to be sleeping that night. And then what some of the intricacies of housing insecurity that we don't always think about. So, school, of course, happens in the majority of it, which happens in the fall or in the winter when you don't have a whole lot of daylight. When someone is housing insecure, They could be at a neighbor's house, or they could be squatting in a house or something like that, or they could be living under a bridge. Like how are children getting homework done when at 7
Come on,
at 6
come
o'clock at
on.
night they're not able to see their books? Just those kind of those layers as you describe them, I think are really they're like multipliers. It's like it's not a plus. After this, like I have this problem plus, it's a multiplier. It's times this,
Right.
times that, and it just makes the problem worse in a really exponential way, not
Right.
just in a kind of in a simple adding way. There are implications to each one of those layers, I think.
For sure. Yeah, definitely.
All right. I actually wanted to ask you a little bit about yourself, Ruth. So where are you from? With the last name is what I'm thinking of. And how long have you been in New Orleans? And tell us about yourself.
I was born and raised in Nigeria, West Africa. I was born in Kaduna, which is located right in the middle. It's where the Niger River actually splits into two. Right in the middle of the country. I was born in Kaduna and was raised for the most part in Jos, which are located maybe about 3 hours from each other.
Okay.
I moved to this country, I moved to the States at 18 after high school, with the intention for my parents was for me to be educated. So I did my undergrad here in Michigan, ended up in New Orleans in 97 after getting married and having 2 children. And I've been here ever since. So I've been here about 25 years,
okay.
Which has been longer than, even the time I spent growing up in Nigeria. So definitely this has been a place that has raised me in a lot of ways. Yeah.
And, I was born in Haiti myself.
Yes.
So I'm always happy to see other people from shithole countries do really well. What were your big culture shocks? I think, of course, here in the United States, there's this particular perception that we have of the continent of Africa, and then I'm assuming that the same goes the other way. So, what were the big culture shocks in terms of what you were expecting and what you actually saw? Tied to that, what is easier here and what is more difficult here than you expected?
Yeah. So when I moved to the States, my mother and my siblings also moved along with me. My mother settled in Kansas City, Missouri. And so I got to spend a lot of time there, specifically my first year in the United States. And let me also say that, I had spent some time here because I had an aunt that had been here for 20 years prior to that. And so, I was privileged enough to be able to, travel every now and again to the United States and other places in the world. But once I actually landed here as an immigrant, I think the first thing that actually just really, really demolished me in a way, because I just couldn't understand it, was the level of poverty that I saw.
You weren't expecting there to be poverty here.
I was not expecting the poverty. It's my mother ended up, in what they call the hood, in Kansas City. And level.
And you were not in the hood in Nigeria.
I was not in her. I was raised upper middle class. My father is an optometrist. My mother she ran the catering departments for large institutions, such as we had a big beer factory where I lived growing up, and she ran that department. So I never wanted for anything. I was sent along with my siblings to American schools for the most part. So there was a lot of exposure to American culture, English culture, because we were colonized by the British, right? So it wasn't a complete disconnect. And so when I actually, on a day-to-day experience would see poverty, particularly in Black communities, which is where we lived, it was just mind-boggling to me. And I just could not understand it. I had no idea why, how. Nobody could explain it to me, because I remember asking a lot of questions being 18, and nobody could really help me to understand why I was looking at what I was looking at, because as you know, America the Great, the propaganda, what my personal name for it, is real. And it's not like I didn't even interact with Black folks who were from here. You just never got the story about, how rough it can be for certain communities in the United States. And I didn't actually get to understand that until my second or third year of undergrad. Some things happened that kind of led me on this path, I feel like.
And what did
was
you come
many
away
lifetimes
with?
ago.
What did you come away with as your understanding of how that happened to us here?
My second year of undergrad, there was a race riot on campus. And at that point, I had a lot of what I call internalized racism, meaning that I could never see other Black people as, meaning American Black folks, right? There was definitely a disconnect for me because I felt like I was very different. And I had no connection with these Black people who maybe looked like me, but we had nothing culturally common. Race riot happens. The college brings in all kinds of Band-Aids, right, to fix what had happened. And they got introduced to one of the Black people that they hired on campus who ended up just really opening my world up in terms of history that I got to study. And, I remember just being deeply ashamed for a while with my interaction with Black folks, from here.
As you learned more about the context about what put us in this position in the first place.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. And things began to look a lot different and I began to understand. And then after several things happened to me personally, I began to study systems and institutions and how these things are perpetuated, right? And so at that time I was living in New Orleans and just was really down on my luck in a lot of ways. Landing in New Orleans for me, I think was just one of the most incredible things that had happened to me in my life because I came here at such a low point or ended up at such a low point after being here for a couple of years. Organizers here kind of just pulled me in and I was humble enough to listen and they just taught me a lot about organizing, about the history, particularly of New Orleans. And I was able to make connections around, what I had read and what I had learned and the personal things that had happened to me and make connections around how people have been impacted historically and how that looks economically now for certain communities and how, people are perpetually attacked and people are held down and the ways that, you strategize and how you fight. And that's kind of led me down this road to where I find myself now.
It's interesting the way that you came into the View. You came here expecting this place expecting not to see any poverty. And then you saw poverty, and then that made you make certain assumptions about the people who were poor here, right? But Black people in particular. Right. And it's interesting that it also happens in the reverse, is that you have African Americans here who think a particular way about Africans, continental Africans, and are constantly asking like, well, if they're, they got their own stuff together, then why are they facing poverty? And when the actual answer to both questions is colonialism, like colonialism did that to Africa, colonialism did that to African Americans as well. And I think, that just the way that you came, it's also interesting that the way that the bridge that was created for you happened through a race riot at your school.
Yes, it did.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, there's nothing that'll bring people together, Black people together, like white people chasing us, right? So yeah, I think it's first of all, I'm just impressed that you were able to get there, as opposed to maintaining this hard line about these assumptions or these opinions about that were really the result of the propaganda that you heard. But also it just makes me think about how we can make sure that that happens in the other direction as well. How can we get African Americans to say, you know what, if it wasn't for colonialism, the reason why I'm looking at continental Africans this way is because, one, of the propaganda, but two, because of colonialism. And that's what we need to, if we overcome that, it'll actually solve both of our problems.
I do also have to add that part of my education was living in poverty for a good significant time of my experience here in the United States, And so what was helpful in a very devastating way was having to experience poverty and then be able to understand all the barriers that people have to deal with when they're trying to get out of poverty, right? Most people, as we know, don't actually make it, but having to have to do that with children was a phenomenal experience that got me to really, really get it.
Huh. Yeah. And how do you think that personal experience impacted your perspective or as an organizer and your ability to organize? What would have been different if you just would have came here and you would have hit it off right away? And let's say you still would have been an organizer. How do you think you would be organizing differently, or how would you be
I
perceiving
don't
things
think I would have been. I don't think I would have been organizing. I'd have ended up in New York somewhere as a clinical therapist, in
differently?
some kind of condominium, and you're like, them people just, they don't understand what's going on. They need to get with this right here. I would have had no clue. I would have had
Yeah.
no clue. I believe that I really had a destiny in terms of how I was led. But I think kind of being down and out and having to jump through the hoops that folks have to jump through
Sure.
and really getting to understand it, it schooled me, for lack of a better term.
So
That was my
obviously
education.
that was your education. So obviously I didn't know that about you, about your personal journey through it. But when I was reading your bio, the thing that struck out to me that stood out a lot was you talked about your sanctuary garden, garden sanctuary that you're building. And I'm like, who puts that in their bio? So like
That
what
was that was
what
that,
does
that
that
was actually a friend wrote that, and I thought,
it was
I'm gonna just leave
a
it in
friend with
there.
some insight to you, obviously. So what does the garden sanctuary mean to you? Maybe in the context of your journey, maybe in the context of the work that you're doing. What does it mean to you that it was so important that it had to be, that someone recognized that it needed to be in your bio?
A place of solace, a place of peace. My spirituality is super, super important to me. And it's the thing that buoys me through all of the organizing, my own personal struggles. And so there needs to be a place for me to be able to go where I'm able to listen to myself, where I'm able to commune with family and loved ones. In my spiritual practice, one of the big components is communicating with one's ancestors, where I can just be quiet and kind of listen to the wind and hear the voices and speak to what I believe is, Mother God, Father God, Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
That's what sanctuary means to me. A place where I can be human, right? A lot of what this does is it strips away your humanity.
Right.
And I think that it does it very deliberately.
So outside of the sanctuary, there are times you have trouble connecting with your humanity or feeling human, and you need to create a space that allows you to be there.
Yes, and I believe that everybody needs that, particularly organizers. I mean, it's hard to be in this world. It's hard to be in this society. It's a very harsh place to be. The way that we punish children really is just it doesn't speak well to how we think about ourselves. How do we treat kind of what everybody would say is the best of a society are their children, but then we treat them in such inhumane ways. And what does that say about how we treat each other, or how we treat ourselves? I think that there is something to be said about, even when you talk about the organizing that you've done around housing, how can we not have places for people to live? It makes absolutely no sense. What does that say about a society, right? That does not value every human life. And I know that sounds very maybe cliche, but there's something I really believe in.
Yeah. It's both the way you're describing that, particularly the way you're describing the sanctuary place, is both really, really beautiful and also deeply troubling at the same time. That there's this need that we all have to do this because of the world that we find ourselves in. But let's pivot back to, so as you're talking about the what it means, the way that the society punishes children, the way that reflects on us. Can you tell us a little bit about in the Dignity for School campaign? What is your role in the campaign? And then what are the specific things that this campaign is doing? You said you talked about it as a national coalition of mainly grassroots, but there are others too. What's your role in the national coalition, and what type of work specifically is this coalition doing?
Well, I was a member of Dignity in Schools for about 10 years, meaning that I was a member of the coalition doing my organizing work here in New Orleans. But then I got hired in December 2021 as a program director. So that's my role. My role pretty much is, we are a member-led organization, let me say number one, meaning that our membership dictate what campaigns we take on, how we spend our money, who we get our money from. They make all decisions. Our governing body, what we call our coordinating committee, is made up of members. And then we have various subcommittees that are also made up of the membership that really make up, they are a governing body. They decide what happens and why. And, our staff, which is made up of, there's 5 of us now, 4, that carry out the wishes of the membership. And so one of our platforms is Community Not Cops, which is exactly what it says, is that we do not believe that law enforcement in any iteration of it belongs in the school system. And so our main job is that we support communities, which are represented by these organizations, to really do the on-the-ground work wherever they are and whatever that way looks like. Some people choose to fight it through legislation. Some people do it through advocacy. Some people do it through education. Whichever way that the coalition needs our support, we're there to offer that to them. And it's like showing up also to support them in direct action that may be happening. We also have our model code, which if you go online to our website, you'll be able to find. And it's just a compilation of different ways that's available to anybody, whether you are, a legislator, whether you're a teacher, student, a parent, that is available to you that can give you ideas in which you're able to improve school climate in your school, in your community. And so we offer a myriad of ways in which that can happen. One of them is, as I said before, making sure that there's no form of law enforcement in schools, but also replacing that with members of the community who can help to guide staff and the administration in order to be able to fit what the school looks like and what the curriculum could be with the community. Like I said, one of the things that happened here in New Orleans was that they took music out of schools. We're a music city that has traditionally always had music in schools, no matter how much schools were struggling with lack of resources. There was always a place for children to learn music. That was taken away with the privatization of the schools in New Orleans. And so the community needs to match the school and vice versa.
You talk about that schools don't need police. Police do not belong in schools in any
No, they don't.
shape or form. So this is obviously difficult for many people to wrap their heads around. So
this is true.
There's a fight in school. A boy pulls a girl's ponytails. Whatever, someone steals a phone, how are we supposed to respond to that without 10 men with guns and stun guns and flashlights with the ability to lock people up, with the threats to lock people? How are we supposed to respond to those kind of things happening in the school without police? What would take its place?
What would take its place is to actually have teachers there who are trained in child and adolescent behavior. Not everything has to escalate to a fight. And so as a teacher, we should be able to be trained in ways to recognize when a child is about to act out, have ways in which to be able to calm students or children down. One of the things that we offer, which is building around the country, is restorative justice practices, right? Where you get people to, regardless of, who it is that there's some kind of tension or argument or whatever breaks out in school, that you're able to you've got trained people who are able to sit people down and have a conversation, as opposed to stuff getting to a place or heated enough where it breaks out into physical violence. Now, I'm not saying that for a school that is troubled with that can happen overnight, but if we begin to put these practices in place, meaning having trained teachers who are familiar with the children in the community. It's kind of like when we talk about community policing, right? Because these are some of the arguments that came out with defund the police, right? Well, who are we going to call if we don't have police? And it's like, well, let's look at different ways with which, as a community, we can solve our own problems, and maybe train police to maybe show up in different ways. So with restorative justice practices, there are ways in which you can begin to train not just teachers, but also students, that instead of escalating stuff, you can actually have conversations. And there isn't too much of that done. And on top of that, making sure that a child has a place to go to just talk to somebody, to be able to de-escalate situations, right? Instead of, you're out of the classroom and, now you're penalized and you got to go home, or, you're in a Zoom room by yourself all day. There are different ways in which we can troubleshoot these problems. I don't think that we should view children, regardless of where they come from, as anything other than, than children. I feel like as adults, we should have it in us to be able to know how to deal with our children.
You certainly don't want to treat children the same way. Okay, so this is what you want to do, is you want to take police out of schools and you want to create a healthier environment for children. What are some of the successes of either the coalition as a whole or individual members of the coalition? Is there anywhere where you've actually won some version of this?
Yes. There are places in Michigan where we were successfully able to get SROs out of school, places in Chicago where the restorative justice movement is really growing. I actually just came back from a restorative justice conference a couple of weeks ago that happened in Chicago. Places in Virginia have had some successes with removing children from schools. Not children from schools, law enforcement from schools. You also have culturally relevant curriculum, which is making sure, I use the example of music specifically in New Orleans, but fine-tuning what your curriculum looks like to the community that's, the demographic in your community. What's the culture there? And, each community has something that's significant or different about it. How are you making sure that when the children are coming into the school that they're feeling welcome and they feel like they see themselves in the curriculum, right? That's also very important. And so we've had the success with different districts, particularly with the culturally relevant curriculum, Racial Justice Now, which was originally in Ohio, but now they have satellites in DC and I believe the Baltimore area where they've successfully been able to use culturally relevant curriculum in majority Black schools to be able to really shift the behavioral problems that have risen, over the years. When you show children that they are special, meaning uplifting them in history and showing them that your people have done some really wonderful things, there is a sense of pride that builds up, where children just feel better about themselves. And if they feel better about themselves, they're less likely to act out. Mm-hmm. But what we found is that as we've had these successes, particularly with the law enforcement being taken out of schools, now there's been a backlash. And so what you're seeing now is that we've been having to re-strategize around that because a lot of school districts are saying, well, that wasn't a good idea. We need to make sure that we have the SROs back in the schools. So There has been a big backlash. And I know that you might be aware of the whole critical race theory fight that's been blowing up all around the country. That's also an added thing that we're having to combat. Mm-hmm. So it's a give and take.
It's a give and take. It's an ongoing. Yeah. So, I am familiar with some of the work that you've done with Freedom Inc., which is out in Madison, Wisconsin, and they won their campaign to get the cops out of school. But interestingly, to end the contract that the police had, so there was police stationed in each public school in Madison, and they won the fight to end the contract so there were no longer police stationed. And that was an incredible victory. And it took 5 years to win that campaign.
I know, yeah.
Amazing. It was a long-winded campaign, but finally they won. And what ended up happening in Madison is that it just uncovered a whole new layer, back to our layers here, uncovered a whole new layer of ways in which police culture or the culture of needing to have an authority just demonstrated itself. And that is that even though there's no police at the school, anytime there's a little problem in the school, the first thing that the teachers or the administration want to do is call the police in. So now they still have the police. It just takes them 7 to 12 minutes to get there. So that still hasn't changed that. And it still hasn't changed the punitive nature of the administration or individual teachers' responses to young people having conflict. In other words, when young people have a conflict, they still want to punish the young people for having that conflict rather than resolving the conflict. So is that the next step? So maybe, I guess, I'd like for you to, and you started doing this already, maybe juxtapose a little bit the difference between punitive justice and restorative justice or even transformative justice.
Punitive justice is taking the child out of the classroom, suspending them for several days, meaning that they miss out on class time and education, meaning that when they come back, they have to catch up. It looks like expelling them, meaning that, now the children and their family have to find another school to go to, which looks like calling the police, meaning that they end up being detained, put in jail, sometimes worse. That's what that looks like. And it's not educating the children. It's marginalizing them further, particularly if they've already been marginalized. But, restorative justice practices looks like, you know what? We're going to go, don't, so one of the things that happens in New Orleans is that there was always a mama so-and-so that was a fixture in the school that wasn't necessarily a teacher, but she was just somebody that the community knew. And whenever kind of somebody got out of hand, they would go talk to Mama Barbara, let's say.
Yeah.
And Mama Barbara would sit down with a child and they just have a conversation. You'd be like, what's going on with you? Why are you being like this today? And because there was a respect and because he understood or she understood that this is somebody that not only loves you, but also expects good behavior from you, there's a shift in attitude and behavior. And that is what traditionally, particularly with Black and Brown restorative justice practitioners, I don't like the word practitioners, I prefer cultural bearers, because there is a culture that comes with restorative justice practices. It's not a cold and sterile world. I mean, a word, say a term. It's something that comes from thousands of years of indigenous practices, right? That we're now putting in classrooms to really save our communities. It's a back and forth. It's a communication. It's, you get to tell me how you feel or why did you show up this way today? Have a conversation and get to the root of the problem. Unfortunately, too many people are suffering from issues of poverty. And so a child might not have gotten something to eat that morning, or there's instability in the home because there's an eviction notice and people got to, get evicted soon.
Well, so why is, okay, so I come to school, you steal my lunch.
Right.
And instead of them punishing you, and instead of them suspending you or expelling you, and back in the day, they would have taken you into a room and done corporal punishment. Instead of that, they want to have a discussion with you, and they want to bring me into the discussion so I can find out that you did not eat breakfast this morning. Why do I care? My lunch was taken. Why do I care if you ate breakfast this morning? Why should I care if you ate breakfast this morning?
Meaning that you're the child who was taken from?
Yes, you stole my lunch, and now I'm being brought into a room and saying, well, what actually happened here is Ruth didn't get to eat breakfast this morning, and this happens to her quite frequently. Why should I do anything but roll my eyes? Why should I care about that?
Why should I care? I think, a simple question would be like, how would you feel if maybe you didn't eat breakfast this morning? How would you feel if your electricity is out and you didn't do your homework yesterday and you were rushing to school and your mama or your daddy's angry because, there are ways to talk about.
Right. But, you're saying that triggers different things, because now suddenly saying, how would you feel? Now I have to, and literally when I'm imagining this, I'm imagining me looking at you and saying, why do I care? And when you ask me that question, I now have to imagine myself switching places and be you looking at me. And it just changes your view of things in a real way. And in one case where you want someone to be punished, and in another way, if I have to put myself in your position, I'm like, don't punish me.
Right. Or maybe just even having a little bit of empathy, even just that. Right. Just getting children to talk to each other and finding ways to even, it's not even to get them to like each other. It's just kind of like, I get it, so maybe we could talk about it, and maybe we could sit down and have lunch together, maybe.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? There are ways to do that. And I think that we do that in the community so many ways. It's a way that we survive. We have conversations, we share, we look out for one another, and we need to build that in our schools. And I'm not saying that none of that is happening. There is, and unfortunately, where that is happening, those stories don't get lifted up enough, right? Because those things are happening. But where it's not, unfortunately, there's a lot of havoc. Havoc happens, and it gets perpetuated. And so you hear the same stories over and over and over again, particularly in specific communities. Right.
And the structural, you talked about how at some point you got to understand structures and systems as opposed to just looking at the individuals. The structure right now of the society is going away from that level of empathy and going more towards conflict, because you're hearing a lot about, and I think in I'm not sure if it's New Orleans, but certainly in Louisiana, where now they are, refusing to give lunch to children whose parents haven't paid for the lunch bill. And then some others are coming in and saying, well, I'll pay their lunch bill, and the school is refusing to accept the lunch. Like, what do they think is going to happen now? The children there's going to be more lunch money taken in that school than any other school. And I think this is where it has to be, I think, a holistic response, because the limits of restorative justice, which sound really powerful, and just a little thing that we just did was really amazing, that just to think about your question of how would you feel, I had to put myself in your position. That doesn't work as well for the other child, for the offender. for the harm, for the person who caused harm, if the next day they still don't have lunch. And then you're like, okay, now here's a note to give to your parents threatening them that you're going to go to jail if you don't pay the $6 in lunch fees.
That doesn't help, does it? It doesn't. And I think that children are pretty much just, they're watching adults around them, and they are taking on behaviors, because they're watching how unjust and cruel the system can be, or people who act out or who are foot soldiers for the system, right? Mm-hmm. It's not good role modeling at the very least, because what you're essentially teaching children is like, it doesn't matter what you're going through, have no empathy. Mm-hmm. You need to have money, to pay for the things that you need. It's just, it does not build up any sense of real community, nor character, or empathy, or anything else that we say that we want societies to be able to have, or behaviors in order for, societies to be able to build, as opposed to constantly being in a place of fear and tearing down. But what I wanted to ask you is that, you had said something earlier about kind of constantly bringing in the police, like instead of having them in the school, now we just call them and they just show up 6 or 7, minutes later. What do you think is the reason behind this need to be able to want constantly, it feels like it's a default, that is what we need in order to be able to have institutions or even individuals for that matter?
I think it's two things. One is, I do think in this society is conditioning people to be punitive. And the first, when there's a conflict that happens or something wrong that happened, I think we're conditioned to want some kind of punitive measures extracted. So if someone does something wrong, the first thing we want that person punished. There's a bloodlust bloodlust element around it, particularly in the international context. I just think that's one of the things that people here are socialized towards. Is that when something goes wrong, the default position must be punishment, not empathy, and not an attempt to do it. I think that's one. I think the second thing is just structurally, back to the structural question issue. Structurally, is that the things that could mitigate the harm in the first place are being taken away. Students don't have access to lunch. This is easy to see where this is going. There's more kids getting beat up for their lunch money because the children doing the beating up would otherwise be hungry throughout the day. There is a rapid rise in house prices. So you have more people who are unable to get jobs because they don't have a place to live, and unable to live in a place even if they have a lower level job. So there's more street level crime. Like, this is not, and therefore you need more, the reaction is both. I want to punish these people for stealing my bike, or I want to punish these people for breaking into my house and stealing bread. I think that's the knee-jerk reaction to those things happen. But it's also easy to see how those things are happening. The entire process seems to be being encouraged. This cycle seems to be being encouraged of having one community pitted against the other, even if it's inside of what an outsider would call the same community. I think
where do you think that comes from?
I think it's capitalism.
Okay.
Like capitalism, you have to, there is manufactured scarcity, and that's where profit comes from, at least at a certain phase, is manufactured scarcity. If there was enough housing for everyone, no one would be getting rich from housing. If there was enough food from everyone, no one would be able to charge, $75 for a steak, right? So like that's the way that it happens, is with this manufacturers, and that's why when restaurants throw out food, they pour bleach on the food, because if they were giving away their food at the end of the night, no one would pay all that money for the food during the day. So I think it's this manufactured scarcity, and that also creates in this need because now you have people who don't have access to housing, to food, to certain needs. They then still need to eat. They still need to have some place to live. They still need to have their needs met. So now they turn to street level crime in order to meet those needs. And therefore you need to have more, someone who protects, quote unquote, those who have from those who don't have. I think this is a cycle, and it seems to be pretty intentionally set.
Yeah, I would agree.
The Dignity in Schools campaign, which seems to be doing great work and seems to be looking more towards, or would have to look more towards, a holistic thing, not just taking the police out, but doing all kinds of other things, such as replacing punitive justice with restorative justice, and all kinds of other, and creating the school climate creating a healthy school climate, also has a week of action. What is the week of action? When is it? Where is it happening? What are people doing during the week of action?
The week of action is actually a national event where we lift up our coalition who have events happening all around the country. And so we highlight these events and, kind of shout out if you're in Las Vegas, this is what this organization is doing around getting cops out of schools. It could be something about restorative justice, whatever that community is focusing on. But there is usually a place where a lot of our membership will gather. There's one city that's chosen in the nation, and folks tend to show up there. And it can look like a direct action. It could be going to the Capitol to kind of yell at the legislators. It could be a celebration, where we just kind of celebrate each other and love upon each other. It can look different kind of ways. It usually happens on the third week of October.
Okay.
So yeah, I would say check out our website. We're always giving updates around everything that we're doing, but definitely the week of action is something that we highlight. So maybe look at that. If you're planning to maybe attend something, even online, maybe look for it maybe in the next month or so.
And where would people get more information? What's your website? And then how can individuals support the campaign, and how can other organizations join the campaign?
That's a wonderful question. Our website is dignityinschools.org. And I would say our coalition list is on our website. So if you are, let's say, in DC area, you can go to our website and look at organizations who are part of our coalition in the local area. I would love for folks to support people locally. I feel like that's where a lot of the best work is done, and actually impactful work. Go check them out. Ask, if you can contribute, whether it's financially, whether it's showing up and volunteering, whatever. But I would say that would be the best way if you want to really support us, to just go check out who's doing that work locally. And they might not be members of Dignity in Schools, but there are people in your community who are fighting against school pushouts and working to make sure that there is a good environment for our children to be able to go and learn. And so I would say go check them out and show up.
Great. Fantastic. Ruth, thank you so much for your work, and thank you so much for taking time and talking with us today.
It's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Okay, that's our show. Thank you for listening to The Next World. I'm Max Rameau. You can find out more about my work at pacapower.org. That's PACA power.org. You can read more in depth on many of the issues we talked about today on the Partners for Dignity and Rights website, dignityandrights.org, as well as dignityinschools.org. We'll be back with another episode of The Next World soon. Until then, please tell your friends about us and help spread the word about this podcast. Goodbye for now, and remember, organize, organize, organize.